Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to spend the next 73 minutes with you talking about observational approaches to studying research use. And I'm also really grateful to be here with Alice Huguet. I'm Cynthia Coburn. I'm a professor in the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. And Alice, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I'm also really happy to be here. I am a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, and previously I was lucky enough to be a postdoc working with Cynthia at Northwestern.
So Alice and I will be working with you today for the rest of the time. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. It would be great if you could use the chat function for that. And while we're going, if you could focus on clarification questions, if there are issues or things that we're not being clear about. It's one of these things, like, we're deep into this, and maybe using terms or talking about things in ways that aren't clear. We're going to have time at the end for fuller question and answer, or comments or critiques and all that good stuff. And we're also going to have a breakout room session in the middle to actually look at some data. But any other time, please use the chat functions for questions, and we'll try and do our best to answer them. So the overview of what we're going to do today, I'm going to spend some time talking about the concepts that inform our approach. And then Alice is going to lead you through the longitudinal analysis of deliberations. And that's going to take most of the time today because it's a kind of complex approach, and we will be looking at data as part of that. And then I'll finish out with a sort of briefer overview of the big idea analysis, and then we're hoping to spend quite a bit of time on questions and answers and discussion more broadly. So to start off, any conversation about understanding the use of research in decision-making needs to be located in a conceptualization of decision-making. And drawing on a long history of research on deliberation, especially in public agencies, we view decision-making as a process and not an event that unfolds over time. So in other words, we don't think of decision-making as something that happens with a single person or even a group of people who sit in a room, have a discussion, boom, make a decision. Rather, it's a process that unfolds through many, many conversations, informal and formal, stretched across meetings at multiple levels of a system. And during those conversations, people come to understand what the problem is in their particular system, what they should be paying attention to, but also a range of solutions. And typically that range of solutions kind of narrows over time in the context of these multiple conversations. It's interactive, therefore it involves negotiation, persuasion, and problem solving, and at times it's contested. Now, the most typical way, come on, slides. Many conceptualize research use as the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practice. That's probably the dominant way that people think about research use. And so I mentioned that as by way so that we can contrast how we think about it. And instead, we think that research enters into a decision-making process in the form of ideas or concepts. So these are research-based ideas that people have at the ready and are using them, drawing upon them as they discuss things. Sometimes it's findings like, a policy brief, or actually articles or practitioner books that have research-based stuff in them, or research-based tools. And these could be tools for structuring the way that, in our case, district leaders work with one another, or like a research-based curriculum or something like that. Now, one result of research entering into decision-making processes may be the adoption of evidence-based practice or evidence-based research, research-based tool. But that's not the only way in which research enters into this work, in our work. We also conceptualize the outcomes of research use in terms of organizational learning theory. Sometimes people could engage with research in these various forms of research and nothing happens. That's an outcome. But sometimes it results in changes in collective understandings, like understandings of what the problem is in a given setting. or changes in routines at the district or school level, which is really about how district leaders or school personnel do their work. So the district leaders may change the ways that they support underperforming schools or schools that are in trouble in particular ways. That's a change in the nature of their work or a change in their routines. Or it could result in a change in policy. And there are certainly downstream effects like changes in student outcomes, but in our work, we look at the impact of research use on district level processes. So that's what we're focused on. And I'm going to turn this over to Alice, who's going to take us through the first approach, which is the longitudinal analysis of deliberations.
Great. Thank you so much, Cynthia. So as Cynthia mentioned, we're interested in ways that research shows up in these conversations, but not necessarily in isolating research, rather in seeing how it interacts with other considerations. So I'm going to dig into this first approach, which we use to analyze the microprocesses of argumentation and deliberation over time, over the longer term. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Cynthia already mentioned it, but we will be drawing examples from a specific study as we go along today. The important information really is that we had an abundance of field notes from meetings about mathematics instruction at one district. We actually had over 300 hours of these field notes to sort through. So part of where we start today is thinking about how to conceptually narrow down those field notes into what makes the most sense for finding considerations that emerged and possibly influenced the deliberations in the study. So given the extent of these observations, as I mentioned, we had a great deal of data to really wade through. And the first thing that we did was identify the major decisions that the district was involved with over the course of data collection. So for example, one of the deliberations was about developing and training teachers for a new mathematics core curriculum. So when we read through field notes, we identified and grouped every single excerpt in which this topic was discussed, even tangentially. And then we put these together to create what we called the longitudinal record of all the data we had related to the decision. And this was primarily field notes, but it also included documents that our colleague collected from attending these meetings. And we named this a trajectory. So each of these decision trajectories is made up of hours of field notes, but it's narrowed down to a more precise amount of them that are specific to policy decisions. So obviously in meetings, a lot of other topics come up, and by doing this, we could eliminate a lot of the unrelated discussion, and these are more tailored. That said, I want to admit that these trajectories were still hundreds of pages of field notes, so keep that in mind as we go. And in the next step, we'll talk about how we read through those trajectories that really showed the arc of the decisions over time. And we reviewed it using frame theory. So what is frame theory? Cynthia also touched on this in the plenary. This comes from social movement scholars led by David Snow and his colleagues in the 80s. And frame theory really discusses how to illuminate the ways that ideas are produced and invoked to mobilize people to action. So framing something involves noticing and organizing information in a way that makes the complexity of a situation meaningful to a group. So there are two kinds of frames that we talk about in this research. The first is diagnostic frames. So these define problems and attribute blame, and they focus attention on some aspect of the problem and not others. They ask the question, what is really going on here? And we call these problem frames. And when groups come to the table to deliberate, we often don't think about how differently they might be considering the problem at hand. And so looking at how they're framing it with problem frames really helps us identify that. And then there are prognostic frames. So as we're reading through the arc of these decision trajectories, we're also looking for where participants articulate solutions to their problems. So they put forth particular goals or suggest tactics for how to address different problems. Doing so might designate certain people as responsible for being agents of change or or suggest a specific movement forward. So prognostic frames, what we call solution frames, are really asking the question of what is it that we should do? And framing is, as everyone who has observed district meetings, it's very interactive and it's contested. So if I'm sitting at the table with one idea of what the problem is and Cynthia has another, we might go back and forth with different diagnostic framing. So this process is complicated and it can be contested because people put forward alternative frames. And one way that people might try to strengthen their argument is through using reasons or justifications. We call them reasons. In some other work, it's justifications or evidence. But essentially, these are the supports that people proffer in order to make their own framing more convincing. So let's move to the next slide and we'll talk about reasons. So identifying reasons and deliberations, again, reasons are supporting different problem and solution frames. And we coded reasons in our study according to their content. And this could be done in a lot of different ways. We actually started with a list from ASIN and colleagues, and then we iterated on it so that it was more specific to our study's context. And the list on your screen right now is the different kinds of reasons that we found were brought up to justify framing throughout the trajectories. So this is the full list, and you can see that research is one element of it, but we're not only zooming in on research. So I think that's one of the unique elements of our approach. We're not just trying to find and code for research, but we're looking at the full gamut of reasons that are offered. So we wanted to see how research and other information really emerged in these complex conversations over time and not in single moments. So I won't go through this whole list, but we do have some papers we're working on if you want to contact us later that go into a lot of depth about them. And we need to think about, of course, defining the thing before we can code for it. So what is research and what did we count as research? Some of these bullet points are really obvious. Anytime you hear a participant say, well, research says, which is quite common, there's a pretty obvious example to come. However, there are a lot of examples that are not as apparent. So as Cynthia mentioned, we had a colleague who was in the field for a couple of years and she was embedded in these meetings. And that allowed us to better see when research was baked into these conversations. So just to give an example, she might know that the group had a conversation about a specific article on growth mindset in October, so that when we see growth mindset mentioned in a conversation in November, we can link that back to an earlier meeting. And that really highlights the importance of the longitudinal nature of this work. These references, of course, are a lot harder to detect, and research might actually be used a lot more than we see, because a lot of these are based in shared understandings. Maybe a group all read a similar article or has previously discussed different research. So we're able to pick up on some of those using this technique, but we can't pick up on all of the examples of research use. So let's look at the slide that Cynthia showed earlier. This is just an example to show you again problem and solution framing. So I won't read through all of this, but just to bring your mind back to it. The context is that this is an excerpt from a decision trajectory, again, the full arc that was focused on whether or not to eliminate 8th grade algebra for all policy, and whether or not they should include some form of accelerated math for high-performing students. So as she highlighted and we've discussed already, what I have here colored in red is the problem frame. So this person, this is mostly a monologue, says, consequently, we could have students in the past who are proficient at 12th grade, et cetera. And then they continue speaking, and at the end of this excerpt, offer a solution. So we know we have to move resources into the schools to help with professional development. So these are examples of problem and solution frames that we picked up from an excerpt. And of course, we had the benefit previously of reading the pages before and after these excerpts. And we paid particular attention to the reason giving that's involved. So in this case, this district leader who was involved in this conversation had a pretty elaborate chain of reasoning, as Cynthia had said. So that involves references to the Common Core and research studies. To pull out the crux of that, of the reason that really resonates, we can see that they mention a study by the ACT. And of particular note here, again, are the words consequently and so, because these introduce warranted references. It helps us pick up on where we have a reason or a frame. And so in this case, they are using this research study to justify their framing and solution. So I want to move to an example, a new example that's a little bit more complex and is actually what we would often see when observing meetings. It's not one person speaking for an extended time, but there are more quick back and forths between participants. So one person might lay out a solution frame and another might add the reasoning, and then somebody else could counter it. So there's a lot of interaction. So I wanted to provide an example of this more complicated dialogue and how reasons can build upon each other across participants over time. So again, this is from the same decision trajectory where the focal policy question was whether or not to eliminate the 8th grade algebra for all policy at the district, and whether or not they should include some form of accelerated math for their higher performing students. So Kristen begins this conversation by asking, what should we do about these high performing students? So I just want to take a moment, if you could read this example. I don't want to read it out loud for you, so maybe 1 minute to read quickly. Okay. So I want to let you know how we coded these. And then we'll offer another example where we can break out into discussion rooms and breakout rooms and have a more interactive discussion about how you would code them. But let's flip to the next slide and I'll talk about the way that we approached it. So the solution frame that we see here, again, we have the benefit of seeing pages of field notes before and after this excerpt, but I highlighted what we see as a frame, a solution frame. So Matthew says, we'll need to have PD to address this issue with the parents. We will, we'll share that research suggests acceleration in math is better when it happens in high school to do 3 courses in 2 years in high school. So that would be as opposed to doing some accelerated form in middle school. So this might be the easiest thing to identify in this particular excerpt. It starts with we'll need. So clearly there's a solution that he's offering. Often solutions begin with we need or we should or we have to, or other active sentence starters. So his solution here is to host a PD for parents when they can explain that acceleration in mathematics shouldn't happen until high school. And the reference to research, where Matthew says research suggests, it comes within this solution frame. So it's sort of preempting the conversation with parents, imagining using it as a justification for parents in this conversation in this PD. So this was actually quite common. We found in our study that individuals in their back and forth used research to bring some kind of authority to a position. So using this approach allowed us to really see not just that there was research invoked, but how they were using it. And there are a few more frames and reasons that we identified here as well. In red, I've highlighted a common problem frame in this trajectory, which is the concern that some parents would be very unhappy if they were to eliminate accelerated math in middle schools. Ophelia says that might be a hard sell since parents want their kids to take AP exams. If they were to eliminate acceleration, so students wouldn't be able to take calculus at the end of high school. So they're predicting some pushback from families. And then in green, we see that Kristen is actually echoing this problem. She's adding weight to the problem using some examples of what she knows about parents pushing for acceleration in middle schools. She says, there's even been a push to have geometry in 8th grade. We see mid-level performance in middle schools when we have 2 sections of 30 kids each in geometry. The kids want to get done with their math requirements so they can take other AP classes. So if the problem is this will be a hard sell, parents want this acceleration, then the evidence for this is included in her response. So that is the reasoning that parents are pushing. For what it's worth, we would have coded this reason as a stakeholder consideration because they're invoking parents. And big picture here again, the problem frame is that it would be hard to sell no acceleration at this restructuring to parents. And then the reasons offer some weight for that, that framing. So we have a second example. Again, this is a dialogue between 3 different participants in a meeting. And Cynthia is going to break us out into some groups for about 10 minutes where we can discuss problem and solution framing here, as well as the kinds of reasons used to justify those frames.
All right, I'm going to do breakout groups, and I'm going to, Alice and I are going to be in separate groups, and it might take me a second to get to my group because I'm in charge and I have to move people around and stuff like that. So see you in a minute. let's just give it a second till I think we're basically all back. That was quick. We're all very obedient. Alice, take it away.
All right. So I didn't realize actually it would take a moment to like transport me back. I was worried I had left the meeting. Okay. So let's move to the next slide. And I'm going to share with you how our team coded this. But again, I want to reiterate that this is an interpretive process. Our team set up rules that we could continually follow, but we also checked back in with each other constantly to make sure we were on the same page. And so we also were able to see the broader context of this. So given all those things, this is what we had come down to. So again, Gary is coming to us with a problem. I didn't highlight that because it's not necessarily very clear, but Adam did pick up on that. He's asking, what are we going to do?
Yeah, and Alice, and what I would say is the reason that we didn't code that as a problem is he's not saying the problem is teachers, I mean, he might not use this exact word, but he's not saying the problem is teachers lack expertise or something like that. He's raising it as a question, but it's not, he's not asserting that a problem is there. But I completely see where, like, I think if he had phrased it just a little bit different, it would, we would have coded it as a problem frame.
Well, also the problem is not in the text, it was in the context that Alice gave us. Like I could only interpret this as him framing a problem because of the context that Alice had provided.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and if you go to Huguet for our meeting, we have attached an article that we wrote a few years ago as we were working through this, which gives a little bit more explanation, but there were times where we would write implied problem frame because he's suggesting something, but we can't take the quote for that. So that gets into a little bit more detail. But Gary, either way, it sort of sparks off this new conversation. And we coded in blue. The blue text is really what the solution is, what they're saying we should do moving forward. So Martina's piece of the solution is we have to think about who are in networks in the schools that other people might go to or follow. We should think about that. And Oakley, part of what he says is also contributing to a solution. They need to have others to go to if they need to know more math. So if we're going to summarize the solution, they're really saying we need to bring people together to learn about this in networks. And on the next slide, we are talking about the reasons or the justifications for this. Marjorie's is a reference to research, Cynthia's research on networks. So there's clearly a shared understanding within this team about Cynthia's work on social networks because she doesn't add a lot more detail. So just saying Cynthia's work about social networks because Caitlin Farrell was there doing these observations for such a long time and because we understand the context, we can pick out that that's research. Even though it doesn't say the traditional research tells us. So there's clearly that shared understanding there. And then Oakley is providing some more rationale as well. So this isn't research-based, but this was actually more commonly used than research in the trajectories that we analyzed. These are content-specific beliefs. They're beliefs about how teachers learn. So these reasons are meant to add some justification for his idea that teachers need to learn about these shifts through cohorts and PLCs. So again, these are references that are in service of sort of the larger solution frame that teachers should be working in networks with this new curricula.
Can I ask a question about the previous slide? So that actually brings me to something I was thinking about as you were describing the process of identifying reasons, because I was thinking when I even read the quote, teachers will, basically teachers will default to the way they were taught. I remember learning that as, in my, I remember learning that research shows that teachers just do what they were taught unless they have really good models, et cetera. So I'm wondering in the process of you all coding, I mean, I imagine it must have just been really kind of like tough sometimes to figure out, should we code this as like, I saw in the coding scene, for example, you referred to like, if they're using terminology, right? We know that like growth mindset, that's a research term, but this is a finding from research. So how do you get out of your own, how do you not go, well, that's a research finding, so they must know about it and that's why they said it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Sorry, Cynthia, go ahead.
No, it's a great point. And I would say that our coding of research use is conservative in that, like, yeah, this is research. There's research to support this, but we had a set of criteria that narrowed it down such that we didn't include this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And actually in a paper that we have a conditional accept for, yay. We make the point that this code that we used for this one, content specific beliefs, likely is a place where there's a lot of conceptual use of research.
Yes.
In other words, people who have learned about research ideas during the course of their career, maybe
like invoking
part of their reason,
yes.
content specific beliefs, but we required kind of a higher bar.
Yeah. I really like that. That makes so much sense to me. And I think that's a great illustration of conceptual use, because I'm sure that person, nor could I say it was in so-and-so 2004, whatever. Like, I can't name the study, but I know that I know that. And I know that I know it because I learned it from reading research. So that's super interesting and a great illustration of conceptual. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Can you guys see these slides? Can you see the slides?
We see it in sort of the, it's not in presentation view.
Okay. I have a funny, keep going, Alice. I'll get it worked out.
Okay. That was such a great question, and it really helps to illustrate how complicated this is. And we do say in this paper, we think there's more research use happening than what we can really pick up on. A lot of it's implicit. A lot of it builds upon understandings that they share. That would be really hard for an observer, even who's there for an extended period of time, to really understand. So I actually think that's an optimistic view on a lot of findings around research use, because I think it's there. And we show, I believe it's around 3% of reasons actually invoke research using this conservative coding that we brought to bear. But there may have been a lot more than that, because you see the ideas invoked throughout. So thank you for that.
We've struggled with something similar in our coding work too, is like that indirect use. And Lori's on the call. She's really very close to this subject matter. But I think that the way we've contended with it is, one issue is like, you have to almost be a subject matter expert yourself in order to code that is research based, right? Mm-hmm. Which, in terms of breadth, when you're coding a lot of breadth of subject matter, it's really difficult to be an expert in everything. Yeah. The way we ended up handling it is we put in a different code for like that indirect use, because that way we can tease it out and say, this is our funky variable where it's difficult to put fine parameters on.
Yeah, and I think that's the content specific beliefs for us. That was our sort of version of that too. And the expertise is also a great point, because I'm going to talk about affordances and drawbacks of this approach. And of course, this is really time intensive. We'll go over affordances first, but just thinking about what you were saying, Jennifer, it would be hard to have an RA code for that and be able to pick up on it, right? So we're already spending a lot of time in this, and it's not something that you can really easily delegate out, because it has to be very, very thoroughly done. So the affordances of this approach, it's really sensitive to capturing research use. And we are able to pick up on ways that it's used. Even those that we couldn't identify specifically as research, we're more able to say, oh, this is invoking some research-based idea. And it recognizes and it adapts to this real life messiness of deliberations. So there's a lot of back and forth and subject changes and evolutions of these conversations and ideas. It also doesn't isolate research use, which I think is a huge benefit, because research was just one of many considerations that were brought up in these conversations. And by attending to all of those, we're better able to see the role that research really played and how it interacts with these other forms of information. And then finally, we're avoiding social desirability to the degree possible. Obviously, people know when there's an observer in the room, but they got pretty comfortable with Caitlin. So thinking about drawbacks of this approach, above all else, it's really labor intensive. We've had a big team and a fearless leader in Cynthia, but it still took a lot of time. So not only analyzing the field notes, but being there, getting the field notes in the first place. And Caitlin took these notes by hand and then typed them up, and it's over 300 hours of observations. And we were really lucky to work with a district that was interested in this research and supported this, but it might be a hard sell to bring this to your average district. It requires them to really open their doors to allow you to observe the innermost workings. So those are some of the drawbacks for this.
And Alice, we have a question in the chat from Valerie. How would one engage, train a research team to support this process? And then she goes on to talk about, the need for content knowledge, et cetera. But I think it builds on this previous conversation. But do you want to address that?
How to engage a research team? Well, we were lucky in that we had a research team that worked very closely together. We didn't have, in terms of recruiting a team, I don't believe we used any RAs for this portion of the work at all. So we had them do some other interesting work. Like once we had made the trajectories, they sort of distilled and summarized the arc of these conversations, which was really great. But I think prioritizing the content and context knowledge is really important for doing the analysis itself. And I'm not sure that answers your question other than to say, yes, it's very important.
Yeah, this was a team of postdocs. So we had, some expert people. I do think grad students could do this work. I don't think undergrads could do this work because we use undergrads a lot in our coding, but it really does require really understanding what's going on in these conversations to be able to do it. The last thing I will say is that we greatly benefited from the fact that the person who collected the data was part of the coding. And as we moved on and she's moved on, we still pass any analysis that we do back by her because there's just like as detailed as you can get in your field notes, there's just stuff that's a little bit easy to misinterpret if you don't have the overall understanding of the context. So that's the other consideration. So this is, I do think grad students could participate in this, but this is some of the more challenging coding that in various projects that I've had for qualitative coding. And so we had a really crack crew of folks. And they also, we co-developed all these tools together. And so there was a lot of deliberation and finding what those lines were and creating the rules together, which made it a lot easier. It wasn't like I created it or Alice and I created it and then we had to train people. Like we built it together, which is again, time consuming, but I think we've all been working on papers based on this data. So it ended up really benefiting us by investing early on in it. So. All right. Can you say more about the role of member checking with the participants in the coding and analysis of these transcripts? This is from Norma.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. One way that we checked some of our developing ideas is through interviews. So we went back to some interviews that Caitlin had done with each of the participants, with the majority of the participants. So that was one way. We also, I believe, Cynthia, this is prior to my joining the project, but there's an agreement that they will review our papers as well in terms of member checking.
Yeah, so Norma, we didn't share transcripts with people who were there, but we've shared all the findings. As soon as we get findings, we go back and we share with folks who, were participating in the work that we did. I could see like code designing, code developing a coding scheme with participants or sharing the coding scheme back and checking for interpretation in a more micro way. I do know people who do that work. It's super time consuming, not just for us, but for our district partners. And, they have more than full-time jobs already. But I think had we done that, it would have greatly enhanced the work. And so I could imagine getting some funding to bring a team from the district together at the front end to help us really understand the coding, and then us going and doing the coding and then coming back, having that kind of structure. We didn't for this project, but I think it probably would have benefited our work had we done it that way.
I agree with that.
And then one last question before we move on to the next part, which is from Annette Boaz. Can you see that you would have gotten your conclusions using any other methods? So
I think,
Annette, that's hard.
I think that's possible. I think it's possible. I think that a lot of the steps that we took with these methods were in service of cutting it down to seeing what's important. So I guess I could see a world in which you read through the transcripts and kind of picked up on similar things, similar themes. But the approach that we took really helped to focus us. And then we wouldn't have been able to come up with some of the, like in the paper that Cynthia mentioned, we have some percentages and breakdowns and ways that you need a filter. Like we use the reasons and frames as a filter, as a way to understand like what came up more frequently and how they used it and how it came up differently in different decision trajectories. So talking about different policies. And I don't know that there's not another way that I know of that you would be able to break that down similarly. Cynthia, what do you think?
Also, very importantly, when we narrowed in on frames and reasons, there are mentions of research use that come about in discussion in these field notes that are not related to frames and reasons. Mm-hmm. So that I guess is a drawback that we could right here. This is not the way that research is invoked broadly in these conversations. This is the way that research is invoked in moments where there's problem solving, deliberation, discussion, sort of these back and forth. And so, for example, if somebody gave a research presentation to this team, that may or may not show up in our data. So it does constrain it in a very particular way that certainly misses other forms of other ways in which research is playing a role in the conversation. Although when you're there, something that we saw is that somebody might do like a research presentation, people then refer back to it. And because we were there along the way, we can pick that up. But the coding isn't directly from the transcripts in this way. So. Yeah. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk a little bit about a second approach that we've used, which we fondly call a big idea analysis. And if you have a better thing that we could call it, please let us know. And as I mentioned in the plenary, it's a technique to analyze the spread of research ideas within a practice setting. And in this case, it's school districts. And we've used this both in this study, but actually, I think 2 or 3 more now studies, and where we trace the role of ideas in deliberation, but also the impact of those ideas in organizational learning outcomes that I talked about before, policies, shared understandings, and routines. And for us, a big idea is a major research-based idea or approach. And in this case, we focused attention on those promoted by the external research partner. Something to notice is rather than starting with the deliberation and looking at all the things that enter into those deliberations, like we did in the first approach, this is starting with the research and sort of tracing how and when the research, a particular kind of research or a particular set of research ideas, how that makes its way into conversations and with what outcomes. So it's a different strategy for understanding this phenomena. And we think it's uniquely suited to investigate conceptual use of research, like we were talking about before with Fabian. And conceptual use of research is when engagement with research provides new generalizations, ideas, or concepts that are useful for making sense of the policy scene. It helps shape decision makers' models of social reality. It helps them make sense of their world or gain new or better insights into the complex issues with which they deal. And so like Fabian's example was a perfect example of that, which is like the research on how teachers teach like they were taught. It's not called out, but it shapes the way that that person sort of thinks about the nature of teacher learning. And it's a great example of conceptual use. Prior studies have showed that it's highly prevalent and very influential, and it's notoriously difficult to measure for some of the reasons that came up when we discussed that example earlier. So what we do is we identify the big ideas. And again, we focus on the big ideas of the external partner because we've studied this stuff in the context of research practice partnerships. So to do that, we interview the research partners about what are the core set of ideas that you're trying to get across. And then we sort of discerned a set of ideas, then we supplemented it with our observations of them working with their district partners. So here's an example, and then we run that back by the research partners. And here's an example of a big idea. And this is how we defined, this is kind of what the chunk looks like, because there's a real question about how do you identify like the chunk. So in this case, researchers emphasize the importance of using mathematical discourse in the classrooms, including teachers should bring to surface the variety of thinking and knowledge that students bring into the classroom. Students should have the opportunity to understand the thinking of others and better explain their own thinking. Students should be held accountable for understanding each other's thinking, and students should revise their thinking orally in a written form. So that's the chunk. Then we identify keywords associated with a big idea. And again, we pass that by our research partners. And then we basically do a keyword search of interviews, observational data, and policy documents. And that's where our friends, the undergrads, came into play. They helped us do that work. Here's an example of something, I will say that when you do that, a lot of like weird random stuff comes up. So you have to review all the hits very carefully. And again, this is like such a smaller, it's a means of data reduction, and it's your denominator, like the data that you're working with is a lot less, but it's still, again, pages and pages and pages, and you have to go through and look at all of them. For example, one of the keywords I think was discourse. And I remember one of the things that it hit was somebody just saying, well, I'm going to discourse with my partner about that. Well, that's not, that is not about discourse in a classroom, and we would throw out that particular hit. But here's an example of something that would get pulled up from this. Quote, I think the shift that we want to go to is the teacher as facilitator and the students as actively engaged in their learning and are able to have dialogue and discourse in the engagement with material and the content. And something to notice about this is that it's nowhere near as nuanced as the original big idea that I shared with you. And sometimes, especially in observations, you get these sort of allusions that are a little bit more general, but sometimes you actually get mentions that are actually quite specific, so that there's a range. And here's an example of a big idea showing up in district policy. And in this case, it was in the curriculum that the district leaders were developing during one of our decision trajectories. And so in the list of expectations for teachers, we see hold students accountable for producing explanation their classmates can understand, help students revise their explanations to make them easier to understand by their peers. And in a list of expectations for students, communicate their own thinking and understand each other's ways of thinking. And another one, hold each other accountable for making sense of mathematics they're learning. So again, here you see a more nuanced representation of those key ideas. And in general, you are more likely to see kind of a little bit of more of a one-to-one correspondence in documents, in policy documents, what we call policy documents. This was a curriculum. So after we find everything for the interviews and the observational data, we do something a little different for the policy documents. We then code who invoked the idea by district unit, role, and level of direct participation with the research partners, because that enables us to see how ideas are sort of moving through the district beyond the folks who are working really closely with the district, with the researchers. We analyze the congruence. So again, is the representation of the idea congruent with the way that the researchers speak about it, and explicit link to the researchers. And this is important because otherwise it helps us kind of connect it with the work with the research partners, as opposed to just these ideas are involved in the water supply and lots of people are talking about them. And as I mentioned before, in this particular study, we were able to do this analysis in 2 time periods, before the engagement with the external partner and after. And this was because we had a very long longitudinal study here. And this is kind of what some of the data looks like. This comes from a table from a paper, and I actually reduced it way down just so you could actually see it. And on the left, you can see discourses are shorthand for that big idea. But there's other big ideas here. And we actually, I think, had 10 big ideas that we tracked. And the N is the number of observations where these ideas showed up. And the percent congruent of the mentions in that observation. And you can see that some of these ideas were in the water supply. People were already talking about them, but not as much, and in ways that weren't quite as congruent with the district, with the research partners. And then you see a big uptick in those ideas and a big uptick in congruence. Other things that we looked at was the centrality of the idea for the discussion. Is it just something that's like mentioned? And again, explicit links to the research partner. Affordances of this approach, you could really see sort of spread of research-based ideas, like, is it only the folks in the math department in this case, or are we seeing them among the leaders, among members of the research office, among members of early childhood department? When used longitudinally, you can document shifts in thinking and spread of ideas. So we were able to do this in the case when we had before and after data. It does not rely on self-report or retrospective accounts, or it doesn't require people to say, well, when I looked at that study by this research partner, you know, the sort of explicit ways that we code research in the other approach, we don't need that because we're getting at the ideas themselves. And it's fairly time efficient, and also staffing is efficient. As I mentioned earlier, we're able to rely on undergrad researchers to do like all the first steps here. And then you need people with content knowledge and who understand the context in order to do the later kinds of coding. The drawback is it's challenging to make attributions to specific researchers, which you don't always, which you don't always need to do. But when we were studying research practice partnerships, we wanted to see how those particular engagement with those external partners were manifest in the work. It's a bit reductionist. Like as somebody who was trained as an ethnographer, you know, sometimes I squirm a little bit that we come out with a chart that loses all the richness. Not all the richness, some of the richness. And it doesn't tell us anything at all about the process of research use. So it doesn't help us understand the nature of the deliberations. So we are just a few minutes beyond where we hoped we would be, but fairly close. I just want to acknowledge the colleagues who helped to develop these approaches. These are folks that we were working with at the time that we developed these approaches. And of course, I want to acknowledge the funders who funded the set of studies where we've used these approaches. And now I want to take time for a broader discussion, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can actually look at each other. That's right. And so you can use the chat, or you can also raise your hand if you want. I will put up the participant thing. We have a question from Norma. Norma, do you just want to voice your question? I can read it if you want. But.
Sure, yeah. So I was thinking about the relationship, or sometimes the lack thereof, between conceptual and instrumental use of research evidence. And I'm wondering about the extent to which you think you might be able to use some of these observational methods to look for use of research evidence in teaching practice, since that is often one of the things that we want so much to influence through research.
So it's not using it for teacher talk, but like looking at like when teachers are in classroom, is that what you mean?
Yes, although that was the other thing I was wondering about, is if a lot of this is about district central office leaders and their deliberations, another step might be teachers talk and their deliberations, and then another piece would be around, but I could see how you could apply those methods there and look at that. But I was wondering about looking at what teachers are doing in the classroom.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and this is not something we have done, but I could see us now kind of operationalizing these big ideas into a set of teacher moves, which we could then build into an observational protocol of some sort, and then look at that. And indeed, I mean, these big ideas got built into a curriculum that was then used widely in the school, in schools in Cypress Unified. So one could imagine then, you know, building those big ideas into, operationalizing these ideas into an observational protocol, which you could take a look at. And that is a really nice way of thinking about how do big ideas get at research use in the classroom. I would also say, like, you could also use this looking at teacher talk in PLCs or in professional development as a way to trace these ideas as they move into like professional development opportunities or teachers' conversations with their colleagues. So, you know, our study like ended at the school district, but I think your insight helps us see a really nice way that you could then look at the relationship between what happens at the district level and what happens in classrooms. So thank you for that, Norma. Adam, you had a question.
Thanks. And thanks for this great workshop and for the presentation today. And I really appreciated your laying out some of the strengths of the observational approach, particularly the avoiding social desirability bias, which happens when you ask people whether they're using research evidence, and the perhaps unique ability of this approach to get at the conceptual use of research evidence, which is so hard to measure. So organizationally, we can see why we divided today's event into 4 different approaches to gathering data, but in the real world, I imagine they're not mutually exclusive. And so I wonder if you could talk about how the observational method might align or be supplemented by some of the others. I'm particularly interested in the survey method, which I think is most subject to social desirability bias. And so I wonder if there's a particular synergy with observational method. And then you mentioned under the limitations, how labor intensive the observational approach is. And so I wonder if by aligning with any other methods, you could make it a little less labor intensive, but still get some of the benefits of the valid and reliable data.
Yeah. So one thing I will say is that we have used the big idea analysis with social network analysis. We have a study, which coincidentally was funded by the William T. Grant Foundation, where we did social network analysis on 2 districts that were engaged with a range of partners. And we are not at the paper writing phase quite yet, but we are on the long elaborated memo about each district. Where we have summaries of findings in both of those 2 districts. And we have findings related to the social networks, what the social networks are and the dynamics of the social networks. And we did a big idea analysis in both districts. And we're at a place where we're kind of putting those things together. So I think it's quite complementary, especially if you think of the big idea analysis as kind of an outcome measure, and the social networks as a process measure, like what is the process by which, and we did social networks between the research partners and people in districts and also within districts to sort of help us understand how these ideas might be moving in and through a system. So that's a very, it's getting at 2 different things that together bring these 2 methods together. In terms of surveys, we actually have done surveys in all these districts in this study. And I'm trying to think, I don't think we've actually ever really looked at the survey data. Like we have ways of measuring, IES funded us to do a bunch of measurement work, and we have ways of measuring conceptual use, research, instrumental use, et cetera. And I'm not sure that we've actually really looked at people are self-reporting this, but here's what we saw when we did the observational look. So I think it's really worth, that would be something that would be very worthwhile for us to do. Actually, the data that we have from this study came before the measurement work, but we did have a survey as well. So that's my quick thought.
And we definitely went back to interviews as well. So there was a variety of different, quite a bit actually, to kind of explain for us some of the differences in reason giving that we were seeing.
Yeah, so it's super, like, we often talk about observations as having a tip of the iceberg problem. Like you see like a little flicker of research in the ongoing stream of activity, and being able to then draw on interview data helps us flesh out kind of, like, we ask about what was going on in those observations, so we learn a little bit more about the dynamics, but we also get at people's thinking that helps us also understand if they're promoting a particular problem or solution, how does that relate to their beliefs about mathematics instruction, for example. We also did a super cool coding that I'm really excited about, just plug for our conditional accept paper, where we looked at the sort of logics of race that came up in reasoning as well. So I think that some of these in this observational data, and so I think that some of these methods can be adapted to a context that's broader than research use as well. We have a, let's see, Fabian in the chat. Do you want me to read it, or you could just?
I can read it. So
Yeah.
I just asked, so from what you've learned from these two different approaches to studying how research evidence is being used in these decision-making processes, what are the implications for improving the use of research evidence? Basically I'm asking the foundation questions, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, so so the short answer is, when we look at the ways in which researchers played a role in these different processes, it helps us understand how different researcher moves relate to sort of which ideas we see in play, for example, with a big idea analysis, or what researcher roles. So the observational data that we showed in Alice's longitudinal deliberation, there were researchers in that data because there were researchers sitting at the table when people were doing that sort of things. So we can do all kinds of analysis about their, when and how they injected research ideas, and how did that matter for the ongoing deliberation. And with a big idea analysis, we have done analysis where we look at the design of the research practice partnership and how that relates to the kind of uptake that we see of the big ideas. And the first pass at that is available in a technical report for our IES funded study that's available on our website, which is ncrpp.org. And that, gosh, Alice, you're not here anymore. We finished that in like October. So that's sort of fresh off the presses. And that's the first time we've done that. And now we're working to move that into an article. But it really, if you're curious, it shows the importance of synchronicity, which is that the findings are there when people are making particular decisions. It shows the impact of long-term partnerships. And there was one more thing that I'm just forgetting, but it can show some very particular design implications. And we contrasted in that study 3 really different designs of partnerships. So that's an example. Adam.
Thanks for a great workshop. I had 2 questions, and the second was actually the one that Fabian just asked about intervention. So thank you for answering that one, and thanks for asking it. The other question is, to me, like one of the really neat benefits that I didn't hear you talk about quite as much about the longitudinal approach is that not only do you have this sort of amazing sort of corpus of data, but also that you can see what happens after these reasons get given, and so you can sort of not only sort of see what happens, whether or not people refer back to them, which is easy to capture verbally, but I was also curious about whether, because you were in the room, do you also sort of have other kinds of measures of sort of nonverbal responses and degrees to which people were paying attention? Can you say anything about sort of what kinds of users of research in those moments were viewed as more credible by the audience, and things like that?
I can speak to some of that. Caitlin took really great notes. And so we were able to actually, she'd written, you know, so-and-so nods or things like that. So we would take that as agreement as we're following the conversation, or she would write down, you know, this person is pointing to a book of data while they're talking about this. And so we would write that, we would include that as data use. So I think that depends on how you're observing, but we were lucky in that how she was observing gave us a lot of rich information just about, you know, and she would write like, so-and-so is nodding off, or, you know, there seems to be something interpersonal going on here. So there was a lot to follow. And I think that was really helpful. So that's to your first point. And then what was your second question? Now I'm forgetting. I was excited about that one.
Second one was if you what you might have learned about, like, you know, what kinds of research users were viewed as sort of more credible speakers of research, and, you know, did you observe like gender differences there? Did you observe racial differences, other, you know, background differences, subject matter expertise differences, just stuff like that?
Yes. So we really in this paper that Cynthia's referenced, the conditionally accepted paper, we wished that we didn't ask anyone to let us know how they identified in terms of their race or their gender identity or anything else. And I wish that we would have, because I think that would have been interesting to see if there was any difference. And that, I think if we were to do this again, we definitely would have. We did look at authority and how different people who have, you know, the technical authority as, you know, if this is my boss, am I going to take her reference to research more seriously? So we did look at how different roles and different combinations of players led to different types of reasoning. Like they used actually different, depending on who is in the room, they used different kinds of frames and reasons according to our categorization. So we found that really interesting, but I would go deeper if we could do this again and ask people more about how they identify so that we could do a different analysis as well.
And just one more thing about this, something we didn't talk about was that we have a concept from social movements theory, from frame theory, called resonance. And that's when when a given frame and reason results in resonance, meaning it resonates with people and people agree. And so we had indicators of resonance. And it could be, as Alice said, nodding, or it could be somebody else kind of repeating the same thing. And when it hit resonance, we coded what we called moments of settling. And what that meant was, like, there's some sort of tentative agreement, and it's not like what the ultimate decision is. It's kind of a step on the way. And I have a paper that I'm working on with somebody who's another postdoc, Debbie Kim, former postdoc, who's now at NORC at U Chicago, where we analyze the moments of settling and what kinds of things sort of were persuasive in these moments of settling. So like we actually analyzed several other factors that helped us with this as well. Yeah. But it's a great point. And that's, again, like the richness of the data. Like anytime you reduce data like this, you're going to lose some of it, but in some ways you need to constrain it because it's just like so much. But even within the way that we constrained it, we were still able to get at some of these dynamics. And certainly if you had video data, and some of our data was video data, but most of it was field notes, you can do much more of the nonverbal kinds of stuff. So we are at the end of our time. So I just want to thank you all for coming and thinking with us about this set of issues. And it's nice, those of you who know, nice to see you. Those of who I don't know, we're now new friends. And I look forward to interacting with all of you around these sets of issues in the future. And just to screen share, just for one last moment, I will put our information. There's some resources which I can send to you. Oh, I didn't put our information on this. So you're out of luck, but send us some emails. Feel free to reach out to either Alice or I. We're both on the web, and send us an email if you have further questions, or you want to see some of the stuff that we've done using these approaches.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.